They called Lady Eleanor Vale the ugliest daughter of Caldermere. And at her wedding feast, Julian Ashcombe stayed silent while the room laughed. He believed he had married an unwanted woman to save a drowning estate. That night, after he knocked and she allowed him inside, he found no trembling bride waiting for judgment. He found survey maps across the floor, rotted timber on her table, and the signature of the mysterious engineer who had protected his lands for 8 years. Helena looked up from a model of the eastern sluice and gave him 21 days to face the truth. Someone was preparing to break the canal, drown 3 villages, and ruin both estates. And the wife, Julian, had allowed society to mock, was the only person who knew how to stop it. By the time Lady Eleanor Vale entered the state dining room at Caldermere House, every guest already knew the price of her marriage. Her father had made certain of it. £40,000 would pass to Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, together with unrestricted use of the canal crossing Helena's maternal lands. In return, Julian would place his title beside the name of a woman London had spent 15 years treating as a warning against female pride. Helena was 34, tall and broad-shouldered, with pale islands of vitiligo spreading across her brown skin from her left cheek to her throat and over both hands. She wore no gloves. She had stopped hiding after discovering that concealment never satisfied cruel people. It merely taught them to demand greater shame. When she took her place beside Julian, a countess near the end of the table whispered that Caldermere had finally found a buyer for his ugliest possession. Helena heard her. So did Julian, before either could answer. Her father lifted his glass and announced that Ashcombe was receiving excellent land to compensate for a wife who was not easy to look upon. Laughter moved around the table with the obedient speed of servants answering a bell. Julian did not laugh, but he did not rise either. He felt Helena become still beside him, not fragile or wounded in any visible way, but contained, as though every muscle had been ordered to remain beneath her command. The marriage agreement lay unsigned in the adjoining study. Without Helena's canal rights, the eastern fields of Ashcombe would remain cut off from the only reliable drainage route in the county. Another wet season would destroy the wheat crop, close the mill, and force Julian to dismiss families who had served his estate for generations. He had spent the previous month telling himself that silence was not agreement. That one humiliating dinner was a small price beside the survival of hundreds. Helena turned toward the countess, who had whispered and spoke before anyone could offer her false comfort. His Grace is purchasing access to a canal. Madam, my face was never listed among the assets. The laughter stopped. Julian admired the precision of the answer and despised the relief he felt when the conversation moved on without requiring courage from him. Helena looked at him only once. Her expression held no plea for rescue. It held something worse, an accurate understanding of the choice he had made. They signed the settlement that evening. Helena asked for one alteration. She required complete access to every sluice, lock, embankment, maintenance yard, and account book connected to the Caldermere waterways. Her father objected that such matters belonged to land agents and engineers, not to a future duchess. Helena replied that she would not surrender legal access to property inherited through her mother. Julian assumed she was protecting income. Sir Malcolm Reed, her cousin and Caldermere's chief land agent. I watched her with a smile so polished that it seemed intended to conceal the movement of his thoughts. He advised the Duke to accept the condition because Helena could do little harm by examining old gates and muddy ditches. Helena signed without answering him. Julian noticed ink stains along the side of her right hand and a narrow callus where a pen or instrument had rested against her finger for years. He wondered briefly what work had produced them, then allowed Sir Malcolm to draw him into a discussion of wedding dates. It was the second time that night Helena placed evidence of her real life before him, and the second time he saw only what the arrangement had trained him to see. The wedding took place 12 days later, beneath the painted ceiling of St. Aldwyn's Chapel. Caldemere had invited every family whose presence might convert private cruelty into public entertainment. Helena walked without a veil in an ivory gown of simple silk. The pale markings on her face and hands left entirely visible. Whispers followed her toward the altar. Julian heard wagers about how quickly he would take a mistress and whether he would extinguish every candle before entering his wife's room. He offered Helena his hand at the final step. She accepted because the chapel floor was uneven. Not because the gesture erased his silence at dinner. During the vows, she spoke clearly and without trembling. Julian found himself disturbed by how little she appeared to expect from him. Gratitude would have made the bargain easier. Anger might have given him something to answer. Helena offered only courtesy, stripped of illusion. At the wedding breakfast, she spent more time questioning an elderly lockkeeper about spring tides than speaking to the ladies arranged around her. Sir Malcolm interrupted twice and finally told her that a bride ought to think of her husband rather than drainage channels. "I'm thinking of his estate," Helena replied. Julian believed it was dry humour. Malcolm did not smile. Ashcombe Hall received them shortly after nightfall. Julian gave Helena 2 adjoining rooms and told her the connecting door would remain locked from her side unless she chose otherwise. She studied him as though searching for the cost hidden inside the courtesy, then thanked him and dismissed her maid. Nearly 2 hours passed before Julian approached the connecting door. Light still burned beneath it, and from inside came the scrape of furniture, followed by the fall of something wooden. He knocked and waited. Helena opened the door only after asking his purpose. He told her he wished to make certain she had not been injured. She allowed him inside. Julian had prepared himself for embarrassment, fear, perhaps another carefully controlled exchange between strangers. Instead, he stopped on the threshold. Helena had removed the outer wedding gown and covered herself in a dark, high-necked robe. Around her, almost every inch of carpet had disappeared beneath survey maps, brass dividers, measuring chains, tide tabler, soil samples, and pieces of blackened timber covered the tables. A working model of a sluice gate stood before the fire, its miniature channels filled with water from a porcelain pitcher. Julian recognized the handwriting before he understood why. For 3 years, reports signed only H. Vale had arrived at Ashcombe with instructions that had prevented the western fields from flooding. His steward called H. Vale the finest drainage engineer in the county. Though no one had ever met the man, Julian lifted one of the maps and found the same sharp lettering, the same blue elevation lines, and the same tiny kingfisher seal pressed beside each corrected measurement. Helena watched recognition alter his face. "You are H. Vale." It was not a question. She placed a length of rotted oak into his hand. The centre crumbled beneath his thumb. She explained that it had been removed that morning from Eastmere Sluice, although Caldemere's accounts claimed the gate had been rebuilt with seasoned timber 6 months earlier. If the official measurements were trusted, the structure appeared sound. If her private survey was correct, one spring tide would tear the gate from its frame and send the canal through 3 villages before dawn. Julian asked why she had hidden her name. Helena answered that her father published her calculations under Sir Malcolm's authority because tenants obeyed a gentleman more readily than a daughter he had taught them to mock. Then she pointed to the tide calendar. 21 days had been circled in red. "You believed you married an unwanted woman to save your estate," she said. "In 21 days, Your Grace, you may discover that I was the only part of this bargain keeping it alive." Julian spent the remainder of their wedding night studying Helena's maps, while the celebration below them dissolved into drunken music and carriage wheels. He expected her warning to weaken under questions, but every answer made the danger more precise. Eastmere Sluice did not merely separate 2 bodies of water. It controlled the pressure across a chain of smaller gates extending from Caldermere's marshes to Ashcombe's western farms if its main timbers failed during the spring tide. The first surge would enter Belhaven village, strike the mill race, and then split around the old stone church. The official engineering report claimed the gate could withstand twice the expected pressure. Helena's calculations showed that it would survive less than half. Julian asked how she could know which report was true without dismantling the entire structure. She tapped 3 blue marks on the map and explained that she had installed measuring plates beneath the western hinges 7 years earlier. Their movement could be read only at low tide. If the gate had begun twisting inside its frame, the plates would no longer align. The next low tide would come shortly after sunrise. Julian told her they would inspect it together. Helena looked toward the locked connecting door and reminded him that husbands often mistook permission to enter one room for authority over every decision beyond it. Julian answered that he was not ordering her to go. He was asking whether she would allow him to accompany the only engineer he trusted. For the first time since the wedding, Helena regarded him without open contempt. Though trust remained far beyond the reach of a single, careful sentence, they left Ashcombe Hall before breakfast in an unmarked carriage, accompanied only by Julian's steward, Mr. Fenwick, and a young lockkeeper named Thomas Bell. Helena changed into a dark wool dress, practical boots, and a brown travelling cloak that allowed her to move without servants, lifting every hem. Julian noticed that she carried no ornamental reticule. Instead, a leather case at her side held a folding rule, ulk, brass dividers, a plumb line, and a notebook thickened by years of damp weather. At Eastmere, the canal lay deceptively calm beneath a pale morning sky. Sir Malcolm's official keeper had not yet arrived, although the maintenance register claimed that 2 men inspected the gate at dawn each day. Helena said nothing about the absence. She climbed down the stone steps toward the waterline and asked Thomas to mark the tide against the eastern wall. Julian followed until she told him to remain 1 step higher because the lower stones were slick with algae. He obeyed without protest. The instruction surprised Fenwick more than it surprised Julian. Dukes were accustomed to being warned after danger, not directed before it. Helena waited until the water dropped below the hinge housing, then cleaned a layer of mud from the first brass plate. Its engraved line stood nearly an inch above the matching mark on the frame. The second plate showed a greater shift. The third had bent so sharply that one fastening screw had begun pulling free from the masonry. Julian asked what the measurements meant. Helena answered that the gate was turning under uneven pressure because the central support had been replaced with inferior timber. She predicted that within 10 minutes, the western hinge would release a trapped pocket of water and force the lower beam outward. Mr. Fenwick glanced at the still surface and suggested they step back as a precaution. Helena did not move. She set her watch on the wall, noted the exact angle of the plate, and began counting the slow vibration beneath her fingertips. 9 minutes and 26 seconds later, a deep crack sounded inside the gate. Water burst through the hinge seam, struck the opposite wall, and sent Thomas stumbling backward. Julian caught the young man by the coat, while Helena pulled a lever that opened a narrow relief channel beside the steps. The pressure dropped before the outer beam could split. She had predicted not only the failure, but the precise mechanism that would cause it. Julian looked from the rushing water to the woman whom half of London believed incapable of attracting a husband, much less directing a water system. Helena closed the relief channel and recorded the event without satisfaction. This was not age, she said. Someone wanted the structure to appear, maintained while allowing it to weaken, where no ordinary inspection would reveal it. Inside the keeper's station, Helena requested the repair plans. Thomas hesitated because Sir Malcolm had forbidden workers from showing estate documents to her without written approval. Julian informed him that the marriage settlement granted Helena unrestricted access. But she stopped Julian before he could invoke his rank further. She asked Thomas why he was afraid. The young man admitted that his father had complained about missing oak deliveries the previous winter and lost his position 2 days later. Thomas supported his mother and 2 sisters. He could not afford to be dismissed for speaking carelessly. Helena did not promise that Julian would protect him, nor did she ask the Duke to make that promise for her. She opened her notebook and showed Thomas a page bearing his father's original measurements, copied during an inspection 6 years earlier. "Your father was correct," she said. "I cannot ask you to risk your family merely to confirm what I already know. But I can give you the choice of placing your testimony in a sealed statement that no land agent may see before the inquiry." Thomas studied Julian, waiting to discover whether the Duke would overrule her. Julian said the statement would remain under Helena's control. Only then did Thomas unlock the cabinet. The plans inside carried Sir Malcolm Reed's signature in bold black ink. Yet Julian recognized Helena's hand in every elevation line and drainage calculation. Her kingfisher seal had been scraped from the lower corners, leaving pale scars across the paper. In its place, Malcolm had stamped the Caldermere crest. Fenwick found invoices for seasoned English oak, iron brace, and 2 months of skilled labor. Thomas led them behind the station to a storage shed where the supposed oak remained stacked beneath canvas. Helena cut into one beam with a small knife. The outer surface had been darkened with stain, but the center was soft, pale, and damp. Cheap alder had been purchased in place of oak. Julian calculated the difference between the materials and understood that someone had taken enough money to purchase a respectable London house. Helena corrected him. The theft was larger because the same substitution appeared at 4 secondary gates. Eastmere was only the one designed to fail first. She spread a regional map over the keeper's desk and traced the water's path. A collapse at any single gate might be blamed on negligence. A sequence of failures would make the entire fen appear impossible to maintain, lowering the value of the land before the railway company submitted its final offer. On their return to Ashcombe, Julian asked why Helena had not exposed Malcolm years earlier. Her answer carried none of the defensiveness he expected. Evidence without authority, she said, was easily converted into proof of disobedience. Her father controlled the land. Malcolm controlled the records, and the engineers who might have supported her depended upon Caldermere contracts. Each time she challenged an account, Malcolm produced a clean copy bearing his name and told the Duke that Helena had confused private study with professional judgment. Once, she had sent her findings to a magistrate. The letter was returned unopened to her father because a daughter accusing the head of his estate office was treated as a domestic dispute. Julian said her marriage settlement had changed that. Helena looked through the carriage window at the flooded ditches passing beside them. "The settlement gave me access," she replied. It did not give the truth a male voice. That, apparently, is what the county still requires. Julian understood the accusation. She had spent years being correct without being believed. While he had required less than a morning to make servants open cabinets simply because he carried a title, any help he offered could expose Malcolm. But it could also allow another man to stand in front of Helena and receive gratitude for repeating her conclusions. At Ashcombe Hall, Julian ordered Fenwick to assemble every canal report received during the previous decade. He did not announce that Helena would assist him. Instead, he placed the documents in the morning room and told the steward that the Duchess would direct the examination. Helena corrected 3 errors before luncheon and found a pattern by dusk. Each false repair invoice appeared shortly before a railway surveyor visited the district. Each altered water measurement reduced the recorded value of one particular parcel beside the proposed rail line. The next survey was scheduled in 12 days. Malcolm did not need to wait 21 days for the natural spring tide. He could create the appearance of structural collapse earlier by closing the northern relief gates while releasing water from Caldermere's upper reservoir. Helena marked the vulnerable points, then realized one set of weekly flow reports was missing. Fenwick remembered that a clerk from Caldermere had collected them 2 days before the wedding, claiming Malcolm required the originals. Julian proposed sending men to recover the papers. Helena refused. Malcolm expected force once Julian understood the danger. A confrontation would give him time to destroy the records and present himself as a loyal servant persecuted by a desperate new duke. That evening, Helena and Julian returned to the miniature sluice in her room. She adjusted the model until the water pressure matched the readings from Eastmere, then showed him how a hidden diversion channel could protect Belhaven if the main gate failed. The channel had been abandoned 40 years earlier and no longer appeared on official maps. Reopening it would require access through land controlled by Helena's father and the cooperation of workers who answered to Malcolm. Julian asked what she needed from him. Helena seemed unprepared for the question. Men usually asked what she intended to do, then explained why she could not do it. She told him she needed the Ashcombe maintenance crew placed under her temporary command, complete records of his estate debts, and his promise that no action would be taken in her name without her approval. Julian agreed to the first 2 immediately. On the third, he hesitated, only long enough to understand its full meaning. He would have to resist the instinct to protect her by taking control whenever danger became personal. "You have my promise," he said. Helena closed the model's western gate and watched the water settle. "Then tomorrow," she replied, "we discover how many men have been paid to let your land drown." Before sunrise, Helena converted Ashcombe's morning room into a command office. She placed the canal maps along one wall, arranged the maintenance accounts by gate and year, and asked Fenwick to summon every lockkeeper whose post lay between the upper reservoir and Belhaven Mill. Julian expected resistance when the men learned they were to answer to his new wife. Instead, he saw something more revealing. The older keepers recognized Helena before introductions were made. One removed his cap and called her Miss Vale, the name he had used years earlier when she visited in a plain cloak and took measurements beside his father. Another carried a notebook filled with water schedules in Helena's handwriting, copied so often that the original pages had nearly worn through. Sir Malcolm had signed the official orders, but the men had followed Helena's private instructions whenever the river rose. She had trained them to read pressure from the sound beneath the gate, to watch the reeds for changes in current, and to open relief channels in an order that protected the poorest cottages first. Julian had believed H. Vale sent advice from a distant office. He now understood that Helena had walked these banks in winter rain, spoken with labourers, no gentleman remembered by name, and built a network of practical knowledge inside a system that refused to acknowledge her existence. The benefit of her invisible work appeared in every account. Ashcombe's wheat yields had risen after the western drains were corrected. Caldermere's tenants had avoided 2 seasons of standing water. Belhaven Mill had remained open through a flood that closed every other mill along the county road. Sir Malcolm received a yearly bonus for improved management. Helena received letters from her father instructing her to abandon unfeminine interests. She showed Julian none of those letters. But Fenwick found one attached to an old drainage report because Malcolm's clerk had used the reverse side for calculations. The Duke's words were still legible beneath the faded ink. Helena was to stop disturbing estate servants with theories that reflected poorly on the family. Julian read it twice, then looked toward her across the room. She was explaining a revised gate schedule to 6 men who listened with the concentration of soldiers receiving orders before battle. No anger sharpened her voice. She had learned long ago that visible fury allowed men to discuss her temperament instead of her evidence. Julian wondered how many times she had repeated the same truth until another person presented it as his own discovery. By mid-morning, Helena identified a dangerous imbalance in the mill race. The northern gates had remained closed 3 hours longer than the tide required, forcing water toward Belhaven. On paper, the change appeared minor. At the mill, it would strike the wheel from the wrong angle and break the main axle before noon. Julian ordered horses prepared. But Helena had already sent Thomas Bell ahead with instructions to reduce pressure at a secondary weir. They reached Belhaven as the mill began to shake. Villagers had gathered outside, frightened by the deep blows sounding from beneath the floor. The miller shouted that the gatekeeper had abandoned his post, and one of Malcolm's assistants insisted the wheel must be stopped at once. Helena refused. An abrupt stop would trap the current and tear the wheel from its housing. She climbed onto the wet platform, studied the rhythm of the axle, and assigned each man a position. Julian was told to take 2 labourers to the lower chain and pull only when she raised her hand. He did not ask why a duke should stand knee-deep in freezing water while his wife directed the miller. He removed his coat and obeyed. The first chain resisted. The second moved too quickly, releasing a surge that knocked one worker against the railing. Helena caught the man by his belt and ordered Julian to hold the lower chain steady. She then crossed the platform to the emergency brake, waited through 3 violent turns of the wheel, and lowered it by inches until the current divided between the old race and the relief channel Thomas had opened. The shaking weakened. The axle slowed without breaking. When the final vibration faded, the miller stared at Helena as though the woman before him had replaced the one he expected to see. His family owned no other business. 30 households depended on the flour produced there. He began thanking Julian for saving the mill. Julian stopped him. Her Grace gave every order, he said. I pulled a chain when she told me to. The admission traveled through the crowd faster than any formal announcement could have done. Men who had laughed at the engagement feast were not present, but their servants. Tenant and tradesmen would hear before evening that the Duke of Ashcombe had stood in river water and taken instructions from his wife. Helena did not reward Julian with gratitude for telling the truth. She walked directly to the abandoned gatehouse and found the keeper unconscious behind the storage bins. He was alive, with a bruise near his temple and the bitter smell of laudanum on his breath. Someone had drugged him and altered the gate schedule to create a public failure. Beside the desk lay an unsigned notice declaring that the new Duchess of Ashcombe had interfered with established operations and placed Belhaven in danger through reckless experimentation. The notice had been prepared before the mill began to shake. Malcolm's plan was no longer limited to weakening structures. He was constructing a record in which Helena's attempt to prevent disaster would become its official cause. Julian wanted the assistant detained, but Helena pointed out that the man had remained visible throughout the emergency and had repeated only the instructions given to him. The person who drugged the keeper had known where the spare key was hidden, which workers would be absent, and exactly how long the mill could endure the altered current without immediate collapse. Malcolm is not merely stealing money, she said. He is studying my safeguards and turning them against me. They returned to the mill floor after the keeper was carried to a physician. Helena inspected the replacement bolts recently installed along the axle supports. The invoices listed forged steel from Birmingham. The metal flaked beneath her file, revealing cheap iron with a thin, polished surface. She found the same deception in the bearing plates and the gate chain. Each part had been chosen to survive an ordinary inspection while failing under sustained pressure. Julian asked whether all the waterways could be repaired before the spring tide. Helena answered that they lacked the material, time, and trustworthy labor to rebuild everything. They would have to decide what could be saved and what must be sacrificed. A field might need to be flooded deliberately to protect a village. One mill might have to close, so 3 others retained water. Julian heard in her voice the weight of choices she had apparently made alone for years, while her father and Malcolm accepted the profits. He asked who had authorized her during the earlier floods. No one, she replied. That was why every success belonged to Malcolm and every risk belonged to me. That afternoon, Helena met the Ashcombe tenants in the granary. Julian remained at the side of the room rather than taking the central chair. She explained the danger without softening it, then invited questions from men accustomed to receiving instructions after decisions had already been made. Some distrusted her because she was a woman. Others distrusted her because she was Caldermere's daughter. One farmer asked whether the Duke had placed her in charge merely to avoid blame when the gates failed. Julian started forward, but Helena answered first. His Grace did not place me in charge of the water, she said. The water did. It has obeyed the same laws longer than any of our families have held titles. She showed them the false invoices, the rotten wood, and the altered measurements. Resistance shifted into attention. By the end of the meeting, 12 tenants volunteered carts, tools, and labor for an emergency inspection. Helena assigned positions according to experience rather than rank. A tenant's son who understood pulleys received more responsibility than Julian's gentleman steward. No one objected after Belhaven. The quiet between Helena and Julian changed that evening. They ate in the map room because neither wished to leave the reports unattended. Helena forgot her supper while calculating reservoir capacity, and Julian moved the plate nearer without comment. Hours later, he misread a sequence of tide marks, and she corrected him with such dry severity that he laughed. The sound surprised them both. Helena looked almost offended, then allowed the corner of her mouth to move. It was not forgiveness, but it was the first moment between them that belonged neither to duty nor danger. Julian told her that he had spent years trying to preserve Ashcombe as though the estate were stone walls and family portraits. She replied that an estate was a promise made to everyone whose labour kept it alive. Then I have mistaken ownership for stewardship, he said. Helena met his eyes. Most dukes do. He accepted the judgment because she was right. Their fragile ease ended when Fenwick entered, carrying a sealed circular delivered to every major landowner in the district. Sir Malcolm had called an emergency meeting at Caldermere House. The document accused Helena of trespassing on engineering works, intimidating employees, falsifying private measurements, and nearly destroying Belhaven Mill through unauthorized interference. It announced that Malcolm would present signed statements from 3 engineers proving that H. Vale had never been a real person, only a convenient mark used on preliminary drafts prepared under his supervision. Helena read the circular without visible reaction, but her fingers tightened around the paper. Malcolm intended to erase both her authority and the identity through which she had done 8 years of work. Julian asked what evidence the engineers could possibly possess. Helena turned toward the wall of maps. A narrow, empty space showed where one rolled survey had rested that morning. The missing document was the original Eastmere elevation, the only office copy bearing her full signature rather than the Kingfisher seal. Someone had entered Ashcombe Hall while they were saving the mill. Malcolm now held the page that could prove Helena was H. Vale, and by the next evening he intended to use it to prove that she was not. The emergency meeting at Caldermere House began before noon, beneath portraits of men who had never been required to prove they understood the land bearing their names. Sir Malcolm stood at the centre of the long gallery, beside 3 hired engineers, a county magistrate, and a table covered with copied plans. Helena's father occupied the highest chair, while Julian and Helena were placed opposite him as though they had arrived to answer charges rather than prevent a disaster. Landowners filled the remaining seats. Several had attended Helena's engagement feast, and she recognized the same polite anticipation on their faces. They had come expecting another spectacle. Except this time, the woman they considered ugly would be stripped not of beauty, but of competence. Malcolm began with humility. He said Helena possessed an admirable interest in estate matters, but had mistaken access to working drafts for authorship. According to him, H. Vale was an office designation, meaning hydraulic verification, not the signature of an individual. The three engineers confirmed his explanation. Then, Malcolm unrolled the missing Eastmere survey. Helena's full name had vanished from the lower corner. In its place appeared a memorandum stating that Lady Eleanor Vale had copied the drawing as a technical exercise under Malcolm's supervision. The ink looked old. The paper bore Caldemere's seal. To anyone unfamiliar with the original, the forgery appeared complete. Helena asked permission to examine the page. Her father told her that she had already caused enough disorder. But Julian said the accusation could not be considered honest if the accused was forbidden to inspect its evidence. Malcolm allowed her forward with the patience of a man confident that every path had been closed. Helena studied the lower edge first. The kingfisher seal had been removed so carefully that only a shallow roughness remained. She then held the paper toward the windows and found a second watermark beneath Caldemere's crest. The sheet had come from a stationer who had not supplied the estate until 2 years after the survey was supposedly completed. Malcolm answered that old designs were routinely recopied when originals deteriorated. Helena asked why a copied plan carried stains from the flood of 8 years earlier. One engineer claimed the marks had been added during storage. She pointed to a correction in blue ink and asked him to explain the pressure formula beside it. He could not. The second engineer offered an answer that confused water volume with force. Helena corrected him before the room. Then made the third man calculate the safe angle of the eastern hinge. He produced a number that would have torn the gate apart. Murmurs spread among the landowners. Malcolm's evidence remained persuasive to men who valued seals. But his experts had begun to look like witnesses hired to repeat conclusions they did not understand. Malcolm responded by producing the gatekeeper from Belhaven. The man's bruise remained visible, and his hands shook as he swore that Helena's unauthorized changes had nearly destroyed the mill. He stated that she had ordered the northern gates closed and then drugged him to prevent interference. Helena realized at once that fear, not loyalty, controlled his testimony. His wife and children stood near the rear doors beneath the supervision of 2 Caldemere servants. Helena could expose the contradictions in his account. But doing so publicly might leave his family without a home before nightfall. She asked only one question: at what hour had she supposedly delivered the order? The keeper gave a time when Helena had been inside Ashcombe Hall with 6 witnesses. Julian immediately offered their names. Malcolm dismissed them as employees dependent on the Duke's favour, then announced that a practical test would settle the dispute more cleanly than competing statements. A scale model of the Belhaven channels had been prepared in the courtyard. Helena would be permitted to direct the water. If her system reduced the pressure as she claimed, Malcolm would withdraw his accusations. Helena saw the danger before Julian did. The model had been constructed by Malcolm's men. From measurements he controlled. For a performance whose result he had already chosen. Refusing would be called cowardice. Accepting meant placing her authority inside his machinery. She accepted because every vulnerable village still depended on convincing the room that the official plans were false. The courtyard model appeared accurate from above. Stone channels reproduced the northern gates. The mill race, and the abandoned diversion route Helena intended to reopen. She inspected the visible joints, measured the channel widths, and assigned the release sequence. When water entered from the raised tank, the first 2 gates behaved exactly as predicted. The pressure divided. The mill wheel turned steadily, and several landowners moved closer. Helena ordered the final relief gate opened. Instead of flowing into the diversion channel, the water struck a concealed barrier beneath the model, reversed direction, and shattered the miniature mill. Malcolm stepped back as spray crossed the table. Before Helena could expose the hidden obstruction, he declared that Belhaven had narrowly escaped the same destruction. The hired engineers agreed. Helena reached into the broken channel and pulled free a waxed wooden plate installed beneath the surface. Malcolm accused her of placing it there during her inspection. The magistrate demanded calm. The spectators had seen only the result. not the mechanism. And uncertainty was enough for Malcolm. Her father suspended Helena's access to all Caldermere works until a formal inquiry could determine whether her interference placed tenants at risk. Julian refused to recognize the suspension on Ashcombe land and stated before everyone that Helena had saved Belhaven while Malcolm's staff had endangered it. He also ordered the false model preserved as evidence. Helena should have felt supported. Instead, as soon as they entered their carriage, Julian told her she would no longer inspect remote gates without him or an armed escort. He intended the decision as protection. Malcolm had drugged a keeper, entered Ashcombe Hall, stolen a survey, and built a public trap. Julian could not ignore the possibility that the next attack would target Helena directly. She listened until he finished, then asked whether his promise from their wedding night still mattered. He insisted it did. She reminded him that he had promised no action would be taken in her name without her approval. Julian answered that he had not understood then how far Malcolm would go. "You understood exactly what I asked," Helena said. "You agreed while the danger was theoretical. Now that it frightens you, my authority has become negotiable." Julian tried to explain that losing her was not a risk he could accept. Helena's expression hardened. "My father kept me from the waterways because he called public ridicule protection. Malcolm kept my name from the plans because he called anonymity protection. A locked door does not become freedom merely because the man holding the key is kinder." The argument followed them into Ashcombe Hall. Julian said he did not seek to command her work, only to prevent her from walking knowingly into another ambush. Helena replied that he could offer guards, information, or companionship, but he could not make obedience the price of his concern. He had begun relying on her judgment when it saved his land. Yet the moment her judgment threatened his peace, he reached for the power marriage gave him. Julian recognized the truth and apologized. But the apology arrived after Helena had seen how easily respect could become possession when fear entered the room. She told him she would continue the investigation and would decide for herself which risks were necessary. If he attempted to restrain her through his household or title, she would leave Ashcombe Hall. Julian said nothing further. His silence was different from the one at the engagement feast because it no longer protected convenience. It held the discomfort of a man learning that love, if that was what had begun inside him, gave him no greater ownership than indifference had. A letter waited on Helena's desk when she returned to her room. It bore the seal of the Western Canal Company in Bristol and had been delivered by private courier, untouched by either family's offices. The directors had studied reports carrying the H. Vale mark for years. They had also received testimony from 2 retired lockkeepers who identified Helena as their author. The company offered her the post of chief surveyor, a private residence, an independent salary, and authority to sign every plan under her own name. The contract required no permission from her father or husband. Helena read it twice, then placed it beside the forged Eastmere survey. One document represented 8 years of work stolen from her. The other offered a future in which no marriage, title, or family bargain was necessary. At the bottom, the directors requested her answer within 10 days. Outside her window, Julian crossed the courtyard to secure the broken model before Malcolm could reclaim it. Helena watched him for a moment, remembering the chain he had pulled at Belhaven, the truth he had spoken before the miller, and the command he had issued from fear. Then she signed the first page, acknowledging receipt of the offer. For the first time since agreeing to marry him, she possessed a door that opened outward, and Julian did not yet know she had begun preparing to walk through it. The broken model remained under guard in Ashcombe's map room, where Helena dismantled it piece by piece before Julian, Fenwick, Thomas Bell, and the county magistrate's clerk. The waxed obstruction had not been added during the public demonstration, Its fastenings lay beneath the channel lining and could only have been installed while the model was built. Malcolm had constructed an experiment designed to fail, then invited witnesses to mistake sabotage for proof. Helena numbered every component, wrapped the concealed plate in cloth, and required each observer to sign across the seal. Julian understood why she insisted upon such care. Malcolm had controlled the official record for years. Evidence left in another person's custody could be altered, recopied, or made to disappear. When Julian offered his private safe, Helena declined. The pieces would be divided between 3 holders who did not answer to the same authority: the magistrate's clerk, Thomas Bell, and Helena herself. A locked box is only as honest as the person who owns the key, she said. Julian heard no accusation in her voice. Yet he remembered how easily he had attempted to convert concern into control. He signed the custody record and did not argue. The dismantled model proved the public test had been corrupted. But it did not prove who had weakened the real waterways. For that, Helena needed the original survey network she had built before Malcolm began rewriting her work. At dawn, she took Julian to an abandoned pumping house 3 miles north of Eastmere. Ivy covered its brick walls, and the wheel inside had not turned in 20 years. Beneath a loose stone in the foundation lay a narrow brass instrument case, sealed against damp. Julian expected hidden documents. Helena removed only a small hammer, a compass, and a list of 27 numbers. She explained that paper could be stolen, but fixed elevations were harder to erase. During the years when her father refused to recognize her measurements, she had embedded numbered bronze markers along the canals, each positioned at a known height above the county datum. Together, they formed the Calder survey. If the official maps had been altered, the markers would expose every false line. Sir Malcolm knew that she used field measurements, but he had never learned how many markers existed or where she placed them. The kingfisher on her drawings was not merely a private signature. It indicated that a map had been checked against the bronze network. They began with marker 7 beneath the northern footbridge. Its engraved height matched Helena's notebook exactly. But the official Caldermere plan placed the waterline 9 inches lower. Marker 11 revealed a greater discrepancy. By the time they uncovered marker 14 beside the old willow bank, Helena could trace a deliberate pattern. The office copies did not contain random errors. They lowered the apparent elevation of parcels beside the proposed railway route and raised the safe capacity of the gates protecting them. A surveyor relying on the forged plans would conclude that controlled flooding presented little danger and that the marshland had already lost agricultural value. The railway company could then purchase it cheaply before the true damage appeared. Julian held the measuring rod, while Helena recorded each result. He did not announce conclusions or suggest how she should interpret them. When 2 farmers approached, he introduced her as the engineer conducting the survey and described himself as her assistant. Helena glanced at him, uncertain whether the choice was apology, discipline, or both. Julian offered no explanation. He had begun to understand that public correction mattered more than private admiration. Marker 18 had been cut from the stone that once held it. Fresh tool marks scarred the bank. Malcolm had discovered enough of the network to begin destroying it. Helena searched the reeds and found the bronze plate beneath shallow water, tied to a weight with new rope. Someone had intended it to vanish when the next current rose. The engraved number remained intact, and a streak of black paint crossed its reverse side. Thomas recognized the paint as the compound used on Caldermere maintenance carts. Before they could examine the tracks along the towpath, a rider arrived, carrying a message from Malcolm. The note offered Julian a private settlement. Caldermere would transfer enough money to clear Ashcombe's immediate debts and would support Julian's petition for a government appointment. In exchange, he must declare Helena's engineering claims unreliable, surrender the model, and accept a mail board to manage the waterways. Malcolm added that the dispute could otherwise expose how desperately Julian needed Helena's canal rights when he agreed to marry her. The final sentence warned that society might forgive a duke who married an unattractive heiress for land, but not one who allowed her to command him. Julian read the offer in silence. Helena asked whether he intended to accept. The question was calm, but he recognized that she was not testing his affection. She was measuring his character against the same standard she applied to failing Gates. He gave the letter to the magistrate's clerk, dictated a refusal, and required the courier to witness it. He stated that Ashcombe would accept insolvency before benefiting from the theft of Helena's work. He also declared that the Calder survey and the broken model would be submitted to a formal inquiry under Helena's authority. The courier left pale and hurried. Julian then found Helena studying him with an expression he could not read. He told her refusal did not make him noble. It only prevented him from committing the same wrong a second time. The first time was at our engagement dinner. He said, "Your father humiliated you." And I remained silent because I feared losing the canal agreement. I told myself I was protecting tenants, but I was protecting my own need. I allowed everyone in that room to treat you as the price of land because the bargain benefited me. Helena did not rescue him from the confession. She asked whether he had known anything of her work when he proposed. Julian answered no. He had believed she possessed property and little else he needed to understand. He had not accepted the cruel descriptions of her, but he had still reduced her to access, money, and a lawful signature. Helena said that honesty mattered, though it did not repair the injury by itself. Julian agreed. He told her that dependence had taught him more than attraction could have done. He relied upon her judgment because it was better than his, and he respected her because she continued protecting people who had denied her credit. Yet even that respect had failed when fear made him order her away from danger. "I do not ask you to forgive me because I have learned the correct words," he said. "I ask only that you judge what I do after knowing them." Helena folded Malcolm's refused bargain into the evidence packet. "Then do not ask me to stay while you prove it," she replied. That evening, she showed Julian the Bristol contract. Her signature already appeared beneath the acceptance clause. The Western Canal Company had arranged a residence, salary, staff, and independent legal authority. A carriage would collect her in 2 days. Helena explained that she would remain long enough to complete the Calder survey record and deliver it to the magistrate. But she would not continue living inside, a marriage originally designed to exchange her land for his survival. Julian's face tightened, though he made no effort to take the papers from her. He asked whether Bristol was what she wanted. Helena answered that it was something she had never previously possessed, work that belonged openly to her. A house no father controlled, and an income no husband could withhold. She did not yet know whether it would become home. Julian said Ashcombe could be altered to meet the same conditions. Helena replied that freedom offered only after a wife prepared to leave was not yet freedom. It might become genuine, but she needed to discover who she was beyond the reach of both families before deciding whether anything between them deserved to survive. They spent the next day recovering the remaining markers. 23 remained undisturbed. 2 had been removed, but were found nearby. 1 had been filed until its number vanished. The final marker, number 27, stood inside the old northern spill field. A parcel Malcolm had recently ordered fenced for railway inspection. Its height proved the most dangerous alteration of all. According to Helena's original datum, the field served as an emergency basin capable of holding enough water to protect Belhaven and 2 neighbouring villages. Malcolm's revised map labelled it higher ground and directed overflow away from it. If workers followed the official plan during a crisis, they would close the one route capable of absorbing the flood. Helena copied the measurement before 3 witnesses and pressed her kingfisher seal beside the entry. The Calder survey was complete. It proved her authorship. The false valuations, the fraudulent repairs, and the method by which Malcolm planned to create a catastrophe. Before dawn the following morning, Helena placed her notebooks, instruments, Bristol contract, and personal clothing into 2 modest trunks. She left the wedding jewels in Julian's safe because they had been purchased as part of the settlement and she wanted no dispute over them. Julian waited beside the carriage without asking her to reconsider. He gave her certified copies of the marriage accounts, a letter confirming that her property remained under her control, and written authority allowing her unrestricted access to every Ashcombe waterway, whether she returned as his wife, an independent engineer, or a witness against his interests. Helena read the documents before accepting them. Julian said he wanted her to stay, but wanting could not become another argument against her choice. She stepped into the carriage and closed the door herself. As the horses carried her toward the Bristol road, Ashcombe Hall disappeared behind the trees. For the first time in her adult life, Helena was leaving because she had somewhere better to go, not because someone had sent her away. Then, beyond the northern ridge, 3 red signal flags rose above the canal in rapid succession. It was the emergency code she had taught the lockkeepers years earlier. Eastmere had begun to fail 12 days before the tide was due. Helena ordered the driver to stop before the 3rd signal flag had fully risen. The Bristol road continued west toward a salary, a house, and a future bearing her own name. Behind her, the red flags meant that Eastmere's upper pressure had crossed the emergency line and that every village below the sluice had less than 2 hours before the first surge reached its streets. She could have sent a warning and continued onward. No contract required her to save Caldermere. No marriage vow required her to preserve Ashcombe. And no grateful public waited to welcome the woman they had mocked. Helena looked at the signed Bristol papers resting beside her instruments and understood that freedom became real only when returning was also a choice. "Turn the carriage," she said. The driver obeyed. She did not return for Julian. She returned because Belhaven's children slept below the canal, because the lockkeepers had trusted the system she taught them, and because Malcolm was using her stolen work to destroy people who had never been allowed to know whose hands protected them. The carriage reached the northern ridge as water began spilling across the towpath. Thomas Bell stood on the gatehouse roof, waving a red cloth, while 2 labourers struggled to lower a chain that should have moved freely. Malcolm's men had jammed the northern relief gate and opened the upper reservoir 12 days before the natural tide could provide cover. The sudden pressure was already bending Eastmere's weakened centre support. Julian arrived from Ashcombe at nearly the same moment with Fenwick, 20 tenants, and every cart horse that could be saddled. He moved toward Helena, relief breaking through the discipline of his face. But she gave him no time for reunion. She ordered Fenwick to evacuate the lowest cottages, Thomas to send riders toward Belhaven, and Julian to take 6 men to the western counterweight. "Do not pull until I signal," she said. Julian asked no question beyond whether the chain had been inspected. Helena answered that it had been cut halfway through. His eyes moved to the black water striking the gate, then back to her. "Then tell me where to stand." It was the answer she needed. Helena climbed the inspection platform and measured the vibration beneath the eastern hinge. Eastmere was not failing naturally. Someone had closed the buried diversion channel with a timber barrier, forcing every gallon toward the weakened center beam. The official emergency plan directed workers to reinforce that beam and protect the main gate. Helena's original survey proved that reinforcement would trap the pressure until the entire stone frame tore from the bank. The only possible answer was to abandon the gate, reopen the old northern spill field, and sacrifice nearly 200 acres of profitable wheat. That land belonged to her father. The grain had already been pledged against Caldermere's debts. Flooding it would preserve 3 villages, but could ruin the Duke's finances within a week. Her father arrived in a closed carriage with Sir Malcolm and demanded that no one touch his northern fields. Malcolm announced that Helena had returned to complete the disaster she began at Belhaven. He carried written orders transferring emergency authority to the county engineers who had testified against her. The hired men immediately called for the center beam to be braced. Helena stepped down from the platform and placed the Calder survey across the hood of Julian's carriage. She showed the lockkeepers marker 27, the true elevation of the spill field, and the forged line on Malcolm's official map. If they braced the gate, Belhaven would be struck within 40 minutes. If they broke the old embankment and opened the buried channel, the wheat fields would absorb the surge. Duke Edmund Vale ordered the workers to protect his crop. No one moved. Several men looked toward Julian, expecting one duke to overrule another. Julian remained beside the damaged counterweight and said, "The engineer has given her instruction." Helena's father accused him of surrendering his authority to a woman. Julian replied that authority without knowledge was merely a faster way to kill people. Helena then addressed the laborers herself. She did not promise that the plan carried no risk. She told them the western bank could collapse, that the first team would have less than 12 minutes to clear the field, and that any man with dependents could refuse without losing his position. Not one stepped away. They divided into 3 crews. Thomas led the first toward the abandoned diversion channel. Fenwick took the second to the Spillfield embankment with picks and powder used for removing tree roots. Julian remained at the western counterweight, where the damaged chain had to be held under tension until Helena released the gate. She crossed the wet platform to inspect the center housing and found the locking pin coated with fresh grease. A maintenance cart stood beneath the trees, its wheels marked with the same black paint found on the recovered bronze marker. Malcolm had not merely ordered the sabotage. He had come to control the final failure. Helena looked toward him just as he moved away from her father and slipped behind the gatehouse. She followed without calling Julian, not because she intended to face Malcolm alone, but because shouting would warn him that the evidence had been seen. Inside the gatehouse, she found him pulling a secondary lever connected to the northern relief gate. A ring of maintenance keys hung from his belt, and beside his boot lay a packet of railway contracts wrapped in oilcloth. Malcolm told her the villages could be rebuilt. The railway would bring employment. Caldermere's debts would vanish, and Helena might still reach Bristol before anyone proved she had returned. He said the county would believe a chief land agent before it believed the Duke's unwanted daughter. Helena answered that he had made the same mistake as every man who took credit for her work. He had learned the appearance of the system without understanding how its parts depended upon one another. The lever he held did not control the northern gate directly. Helena had altered that mechanism 5 years earlier after a keeper nearly lost his hand. It released only when the lower safety catch was raised from outside. Malcolm pulled again, confused by the resistance. Helena took the oilcloth packet and backed toward the door. He seized her wrist. She drove the brass edge of her folding rule against his fingers and broke his grip. But he blocked the exit and reached for the papers. Thomas Bell entered through the rear hatch with 2 lockkeepers. They restrained Malcolm while Helena removed the keys from his belt. She did not ask Julian to save her. By the time he reached the gatehouse, Malcolm was already bound. The railway contracts were in Helena's custody, and the workers were waiting for her signal. The center beam gave its first full crack. Helena ran back onto the platform and raised the green flag. Julian and his crew pulled the western counterweight, keeping the damaged gate aligned for the few seconds she required. Thomas opened the safety catch. The buried diversion channel remained blocked by Malcolm's timber barrier, so Helena ordered Fenwick to fire the powder at the Spillfield embankment. Duke Edmund shouted that she was destroying Caldermere property. Helena held the flag aloft. The blast broke the old earthwork in a rolling wall of mud. Water turned north with such force that it pulled trees from the bank and spread across the wheat in a dark, widening sheet. At the same instant, Helena dropped the signal. Julian released the counterweight, and Eastmere's centre gate tore loose behind them. The surge struck the empty diversion route instead of Belhaven. Men ran from the platform as timber shattered across the canal. Julian reached the bank with his shoulder bloodied by a broken chain. But he remained standing. Helena watched the flood enter the field, rise to the level marked in her survey, and stop less than 2 feet below the road to the first village. Belhaven's church bell began ringing across the water. Another bell answered from the southern farms. Then a third from beyond the mill. They were not alarms. The villages were signalling that the channels had held. Helena lowered the flag only after Thomas confirmed every crew had cleared the spill field. Her father stood in silence as the wheat he valued above her, judgment disappeared beneath the controlled flood. Malcolm was brought forward with the maintenance keys, forged orders, and railway contracts displayed before witnesses. The packet contained payment schedules tied to the exact parcels whose elevations had been altered, including a final commission due after irreversible water damage reduced their purchase price. Helena placed the Calder survey beside the contracts and sealed both in Thomas's presence. The disaster had not destroyed her evidence. It had completed it. Julian approached only after the last family was confirmed safe. He told Helena that her Bristol carriage remained ready and that no one at Ashcombe would prevent her departure once the roads cleared. He did not ask whether saving his estate had changed her decision. Helena looked across the drowned wheat, the standing villages, and the workers repeating her orders to one another with her name attached at last. Returning had not surrendered her freedom. It had demonstrated what that freedom was for. Before she could answer Julian, the county magistrate's clerk arrived, carrying an emergency summons. A public inquiry would convene the next morning, and Malcolm had already claimed that Helena caused the flood to conceal her earlier mistakes. This time, however, the water itself had followed her map before hundreds of witnesses. The county hall had never held so many people for a dispute about water. Landowners filled the front benches. Tenants crowded the rear. And villagers from Belhaven stood along the walls in clothes still marked by mud from the night before. The guests who had laughed at Helena's engagement feast occupied seats beneath the magistrate's platform, their curiosity sharpened by the rumour that Caldemere's ugliest daughter had destroyed her father's finest wheat field and called it salvation. Sir Malcolm entered under guard but without chains. Dressed as though he expected reason and rank to restore him before luncheon, Duke Edmund Vale sat beside his solicitor and refused to look toward Helena. Julian offered his wife his arm at the door. She declined it, not in rejection, but because both hands carried the locked case containing the Calder survey. Julian walked beside her and allowed the room to see that she required neither guidance nor display. When the chief magistrate asked which gentleman would present the technical evidence, Helena placed the case on the central table and answered, "I will." The water did not consult a gentleman before obeying the laws. "I am here to explain." Malcolm's solicitor spoke first. He described the flood as an act of reckless destruction committed by a woman desperate to prove theories rejected by qualified engineers. He argued that Eastmere might have survived if Helena had permitted the centre gate to be reinforced. He called the railway contracts private negotiations unrelated to maintenance and suggested that the keys found on Malcolm were carried as part of his ordinary duties. The controlled flooding of the northern field, he said, had conveniently erased the physical evidence required to determine whether sabotage had occurred. Helena waited until he finished. Then she unrolled 2 maps side by side, Malcolm's official plan and the original Calder survey. She placed marker 27 between them. The bronze plate showed the true height of the spill field, while Malcolm's copy raised it by nearly 4 feet and redirected emergency water toward Belhaven. Helena explained the difference without ornament. Had the workers followed his plan, the water would have struck the first cottages in 37 minutes. by opening the old basin. They had absorbed the surge at the exact elevation recorded 8 years earlier. The magistrate asked how she could prove the bronze marker had not been manufactured after the flood. Helena produced dated notebooks from 3 retired lockkeepers. A foundry receipt bearing the numbers of all 27 markers, and sealed statements showing where each had been recovered before the crisis. Malcolm's forged map stood alone. Helena's measurements were repeated across 8 years of independent records. She next presented the broken demonstration model. The magistrate's clerk, Thomas Bell, and Julian each delivered the sealed portion entrusted to them. Their signatures remained unbroken across the wrappings. When the pieces were assembled, the waxed barrier could be seen fastened beneath the channel lining where Helena could not have placed it during the public test. One of Malcolm's engineers claimed the barrier represented a legitimate structural feature. Helena invited him to identify its function. He spoke of controlling back pressure. She asked him to calculate what the obstruction would do at the scale used in the model. He gave a confused answer and attempted to consult his notes. Helena completed the calculation aloud, showing that the plate guaranteed reversal of the flow and destruction of the miniature mill, regardless of which sequence she ordered. She then asked the other 2 engineers to explain the blue pressure formula copied onto the forged Eastmere survey. Neither could do so. One finally admitted that Malcolm's clerk had provided the statements they signed and that they had never inspected Eastmere. The second confessed that he received a Caldermere contract 2 days after agreeing to testify. By the time the third man withdrew his support, the gentleman who had once accepted their authority without question had begun studying Helena's maps as though embarrassed by how easily a male signature had satisfied them. Thomas Bell testified that Helena had trained the lockkeepers to read pressure changes years before anyone knew the name H. Vale. The Belhaven miller described how she divided the current while Julian followed her orders at the lower chain. Farmers produced drainage schedules in her handwriting, some so old that the paper had yellowed at the folds. Fenwick submitted Ashcombe's harvest accounts, demonstrating that yields improved in the exact years Helena revised the waterways. Every success publicly credited to Malcolm could be traced to one of her unsigned instructions. Every failed repair carried his approval and an inflated invoice. Helena laid the false oak bills beside samples of stained alder taken from Eastmere. She matched the black paint on the maintenance cart to the streak found on the bronze marker Malcolm's men had attempted to sink. Finally, she opened the packet seized in the gatehouse. The railway contracts listed commissions due to Malcolm after irreversible water damage reduced the value of specific parcels. Each parcel corresponded to an elevation altered on his official map. The final payment depended upon the northern spill field remaining closed during a major failure. Malcolm had not merely predicted the disaster. He had priced the land he expected it to create. Duke Edmund rose before the magistrates could question his agent. He said his daughter had always possessed a forceful imagination and an unfortunate desire to exceed the natural boundaries of her position. He admitted allowing her to study estate papers, but denied knowing that her private exercises had been sent to workers as official instructions. Helena turned toward him for the first time. She produced 12 reports bearing corrections in her hand and approval marks from his signet. She presented letters in which he ordered Malcolm to remove her name while preserving her calculations. One contained his instruction that tenants must never learn. Caldermere's waterways were being directed by a woman whose appearance already exposed the family to ridicule. The Duke called the sentence a private expression taken out of context. Helena answered that its context was 8 years of labor he used, concealed, and rewarded through another person. "You did not doubt my competence," she said. "You feared the embarrassment of admitting where it lived." The room became so quiet that the scratch of the clerk's pen could be heard from the rear benches. Her father had publicly offered land as compensation for her face. Now the same witnesses watched him confronted with proof that the land itself had survived because of her mind. Malcolm abandoned restraint. He claimed Helena had manipulated Julian. turned servants against their lawful superiors, and sacrificed Caldermere property to secure a professional appointment in Bristol. Helena placed the signed contract before the magistrates. Its date showed that she had accepted it before Eastmere failed. She had possessed a paid position, a private house, and a lawful route out of the marriage when she chose to turn back. Returning brought her no financial advantage. It endangered the future already guaranteed to her. Malcolm accused Julian of ordering her return to protect Ashcombe. Julian remained silent until the chief magistrate asked him directly. He stood without moving in front of Helena and said he had neither ordered nor requested her return. He then submitted Malcolm's settlement offer and his witnessed refusal. When asked why he trusted Helena's authority, Julian answered that her measurements had repeatedly proved correct. But he did not end there. "I knew society had undervalued my wife," he said. "My greater shame is that, for one evening, I found that injustice convenient. I remained silent while her father treated her as compensation for land because I needed the bargain. I do not deserve credit for recognizing her after her knowledge saved me. I owe accountability for failing to recognize her before it did." The magistrates ordered Malcolm held on charges of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, sabotage, and deliberate endangerment. His maintenance keys, accounts, and railway correspondence were seized. The 3 engineers were referred for prosecution and professional sanction. Duke Edmund was not arrested, but the hall heard the ruling strip Caldermere of emergency control over every shared waterway until a permanent authority could be established. The chief magistrate asked Julian whether Ashcombe would accept temporary command. Julian replied that transferring power from one unqualified duke to another would repeat the error that brought them there. He recommended Helena. A landowner near the front objected that no woman had chaired a county engineering authority. Helena answered that no precedent had opened the spill field the previous night either. Yet the villagers remained standing. The Belhaven residents rose first. Then the lockkeepers stood, followed by the miller, the farmers, and finally several landowners whose estates depended upon the same channels. Their support did not sound like applause for a rescued victim. It sounded like recognition of the person they now understood they required. The chief magistrate granted Helena temporary final authority over engineering, maintenance contracts, staffing, and emergency operations until the new water trust could be legally constituted. He began to identify her as the Duchess of Ashcombe. Helena interrupted him. "Record the appointment under Eleanor Vale," she said. "My husband's title did not design the system, and my authority must not disappear if my marriage does." Julian was the first person to sign the recommendation beneath that condition. Her father watched from a bench no longer raised above hers. The countess, who had asked whether Helena would veil herself at the wedding, lowered her eyes as Helena passed. Helena did not demand an apology and did not wait for admiration. She carried the Calder survey to the clerk's desk, pressed the kingfisher seal beside her own full name, and signed the first public engineering order of her life. The Calder Ashcombe Water Trust was constituted 6 weeks after the inquiry, not in a drawing room controlled by either family, but in the same county hall where Helena had signed her first public engineering order. Its charter gave her final authority over design, emergency operations, hiring, maintenance, contracts, and the removal of any official who concealed structural risk. Her salary came from the trust rather than from Ashcombe or Caldermere, and her appointment remained valid regardless of her marital status. The 27 bronze markers of the Calder survey were entered into the county record as protected instruments. Every future map required her kingfisher seal or that of a surveyor she personally certified. When one landowner proposed naming Julian honorary chairman to make the arrangement more acceptable to society, Julian declined before Helena needed to answer. The trust was created because titles stood where knowledge should have stood, he said. It would be a poor beginning to place mine above hers. Helena amended the charter further. Lockkeepers gained the right to report dangerous orders directly to the board without losing their homes. And labourers could refuse work on a structure declared unsafe by a qualified surveyor. The system would no longer depend upon one woman's ability to work invisibly. It would preserve the right of the next person who saw the truth to speak before disaster made belief unavoidable. Sir Malcolm Reed's trial exposed theft extending far beyond the waterways. He had diverted repair funds, falsified crop valuations, bribed engineers, and negotiated privately with the railway company while claiming to defend Caldermere interests. The railway directors denied authorizing sabotage, but their correspondence proved they had accepted suspiciously favorable surveys without asking how the land had lost value so quickly. The contracts were voided, and Malcolm was sentenced for fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and deliberate endangerment. The engineers who signed his statements lost their county appointments and faced prosecution for perjury. Duke Edmund Vale avoided prison because no evidence showed he knew of the planned flood. But the judgment was severe in the language he understood best. He lost control of the shared waterways, surrendered the northern spillfield to the trust, repaid money taken from maintenance accounts, and signed a public declaration identifying Helena as the author of the designs issued under Malcolm's name. He attempted to negotiate the wording until Helena placed the original letters before him. She did not ask him to call her brilliant, beautiful, or forgiving. She required accuracy. His final declaration stated that he had known of her competence, hidden her authorship, and profited from her work while allowing society to treat her as an embarrassment. The admission appeared in every newspaper that had once printed jokes about his eldest daughter. Helena did not move back into Julian's rooms after the inquiry. She remained in her own suite at Ashcombe while preparing the trust's first reconstruction plan. And the Bristol contract stayed open on her desk. The Western Canal Company revised its offer when she explained that she could not abandon the district during the rebuilding. Instead of demanding full-time residence, the directors appointed her consulting surveyor for 3 major projects and preserved the house they had offered for her use. Helena accepted. She would spend part of each year in Bristol, publish every report under her own name, and train apprentices chosen for ability rather than family. Julian made no argument about how often a wife should live beneath her husband's roof. He asked only that the trust schedules be shared early enough for Ashcombe to provide labour when requested. Their conversations became careful again, but not cold. He attended engineering meetings only when invited, learned to ask whether Helena wanted assistance before offering it, and corrected any man who addressed technical questions to him while she stood in the room. None of this erased the engagement feast or the carriage argument. It showed that his apology had become practice rather than performance. When the reconstruction accounts were secure, Julian asked Helena to meet him in the morning room where she had first directed the canal investigation. No solicitor sat beside him, and no member of either family had been invited. On the table lay the marriage settlement, a deed transferring her maternal property entirely beyond Ashcombe control, certified copies of the trust charter, and a legal separation agreement already signed by Julian. The agreement granted Helena independent residence, preserved her income and titles if she wished to use them, and placed no restriction upon her work or travel. He told her that the marriage had begun under pressure created by his debts and her father's control. Although Helena had consented to the ceremony, neither of them had entered it with the freedom they possessed now. "I want you to remain my wife," he said. "But what I want cannot be the final obligation placed upon you. You saved my estate, yet you owe it nothing. You saved me from becoming the sort of man who mistakes need for entitlement, yet you owe me nothing for learning late. These papers give you the exit I should have ensured before I ever asked for your hand." Helena read every page, while Julian waited without approaching her. The separation was not symbolic. A carriage, residence, income, profession, and legal authority already stood beyond the door. Leaving would not reduce her to dependence or exile. She placed the signed agreement beside the Bristol contract and told Julian that remaining would require conditions no affectionate promise could replace. Her property would remain hers. No Ashcombe contract affecting tenants, drainage, wages, or land use would be valid without both signatures. He would never use marriage or title to prevent her from accepting work. In public matters involving her expertise, he would not speak unless asked. If they disagreed, he would argue his case and accept that she might still decide against him. Her private rooms would remain hers, and every door between them would open only by mutual invitation. Julian accepted each condition without negotiation. Helena then added the most difficult one. You must never present your restraint as a gift to me. My freedom is not evidence of your goodness. It is the ordinary condition under which love becomes possible. Julian looked at the separation agreement and answered, Then I will treat it as ordinary, even on the days when doing so is difficult. She did not choose him that morning. Helena took the papers to Bristol and spent 3 weeks inspecting a failing canal junction for the company. She lived alone in the house provided for her, signed her own expenses, dismissed a contractor who attempted to alter her findings, and watched her name printed on an official report without disguise for the first time. The distance clarified what Ashcombe had become. She did not miss protection, wealth, or the borrowed authority of a duchess. She missed Julian's willingness to learn, the quiet meals over maps, and the way he now listened through an entire answer rather than preparing to replace it with his own. More importantly, she knew she could return without surrendering the life she had established. When her work in Bristol ended, she sent no warning. She arrived at Ashcombe Hall near dusk and found Julian in the West Office, reviewing tenant leases, amended according to the new trust rules. He rose when she entered, but did not move closer. Helena placed the unsigned separation agreement on the desk. I have decided not to use this, she said. Julian's hope appeared openly, but he still asked whether she was certain. No, Helena replied. Certainty is what people demand when they wish to make choice permanent. I choose you now. I expect both of us to remain worthy of choosing again tomorrow. Their second vows were spoken privately beside the restored Eastmere Channel after the first new gates had passed inspection. There were no wedding gifts, no transfer of land, and no father to offer Helena as compensation. Thomas Bell and Fenwick served as witnesses, while the Miller's family brought bread from the first grain ground after the flood. Julian promised no ownership. Helena promised no obedience. They agreed to honesty, shared stewardship, separate authority, and the right to speak without fear of punishment. When Julian kissed her, he waited until she closed the distance between them. The moment belonged to neither bargain nor rescue. It was the choice left after every practical reason for the marriage had been removed. A year later, the new northern sluice opened before representatives from all 3 villages. Helena stood on the inspection platform in a dark burgundy coat, the pale markings across her face and hands uncovered in the clear morning light. Her name and kingfisher seal had been cast into the iron control housing, not as decoration, but as the mark of the engineer responsible for the structure. Duke Edmund attended from the rear of the crowd, without a place on the platform. The Countess, who had once questioned whether Helena should wear a veil, now waited among the other guests for permission to approach. Julian stood below with the lock keepers and labourers. When the magistrate attempted to invite him forward first, he directed the man toward Helena without speaking for her. She opened the gate. I watched the water divide cleanly through the channels she had designed, and addressed the community in her own name. She had once been described as the price a duke paid for land. Now the land carried her calculations. The law carried her authority. And the people who depended upon both understood precisely whose labor had kept them standing. When her speech ended, Julian did not claim the moment with a public embrace. He waited until Helena descended, offered his hand, and let her decide whether to take it. She did not because she needed help crossing the ground, but because she was free to choose the man waiting on the other side.